You do not enter a different year merely by hoping that circumstances will improve. A different year is created when you become someone your current habits can no longer contain. This is the truth most individuals avoid confronting. They desire transformation in their environment, while genuine transformation begins only when something changes within them first. If you are honest with yourself, you can already sense the familiar pattern attempting to repeat itself. The same ambitions, the same promises, the same conviction that this time will somehow be different. For a moment, it feels convincing. You feel energized, focused, prepared to move in a new direction. Yet gradually, something familiar begins to return. The urgency weakens. Discipline softens. The small habits you believed you had abandoned quietly reappear. Not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to draw you back into the same cycle you have already experienced before. And this is the not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to draw you back into the same cycle you have already experienced before. And this is the difficult truth to confront, because it is not a problem of intention. Your intentions were always present. The real issue is who you become when motivation disappears. It is the version of yourself that emerges when no one is watching and nothing external is forcing you forward. Because your life is not ultimately shaped by what you desire, it is shaped by what you repeatedly do, and what you repeatedly do emerges from what you believe yourself to be. Identity operates silently, yet its influence governs far more than most people realize. A person may establish ambitious goals, design detailed strategies, and feel powerful bursts of energy at the beginning. But if identity remains unchanged, behavior eventually returns to what feels familiar. And familiar patterns inevitably recreate familiar outcomes. This is why so many people move through years familiar. And familiar patterns inevitably recreate familiar outcomes. This is why so many people move through years without truly progressing. The calendar advances, the year changes. Yet internally, nothing has shifted. And over time, this realization becomes heavier than failure itself, because deep within, you know you are capable of more. You catch glimpses of it. Moments where you act with clarity, where your actions align with something greater, where you briefly become the person you know you could be. But those moments fade, and this is where frustration begins to grow. Eventually, that frustration sharpens into something more precise, more honest. You stop blaming external conditions. You stop waiting for the perfect moment, and you begin to recognize the deeper truth. Nothing changes until you change. That realization may feel heavy, but it is also liberating, because it returns power to where it belongs. It reveals that the future you desire is not unreachable. It exists on the other side of becoming someone different from who you are today. Yet becoming that version of yourself is uncomfortable. It requires actions that conflict with your current habits. It demands decisions that initially feel unnatural. It asks you to uphold standards your former self would have compromised. Most people retreat at this point, not because transformation is impossible, but because they underestimate what transformation truly requires. They assume change should feel smooth, natural, effortless. But authentic transformation feels unfamiliar because you are entering territory you have never inhabited before. And this is where separation begins. Some retreat back into what they already know. They tell themselves they will begin again later. They wait for inspiration to return, and slowly they drift back into the same patterns that once kept them trapped. Others choose differently. They act without waiting for motivation. They follow through even when discomfort is present. They build discipline where hesitation once existed. And over time, those small decisions begin reshaping every area of life. Because once identity begins to change, actions naturally follow. What once felt difficult becomes normal. What once demanded effort becomes part of your nature. And this is when genuine transformation naturally follow. What once felt difficult becomes normal. What once demanded effort becomes part of your nature. And this is when genuine transformation begins to reveal itself, not only in what you do, but in how you live. So if you desire a different year, do not focus only on new goals. Focus on becoming the kind of person who naturally achieves them. because the next 12 months will either reflect the same version of yourself or reveal what becomes possible when you finally choose transformation over repetition. Within every individual exists a governing force so quiet in its operation that it often goes unnoticed, yet so powerful in its influence that it determines the direction of his entire life. This force is not found in intention, nor in the plans created during moments of clarity. It exists within identity, the image a man holds of himself, which directs behavior without requiring conscious effort. A man may declare that he desires change. He may establish new goals, make promises, and experience waves of determination strong enough to convince him transformation has already begun. Yet if the identity from which those actions emerge remains unchanged, the effort will not endure. For identity, not intention, governs consistency. This truth is not immediately recognized because people observe their actions and assume those actions are products of conscious choice. They believe behavior is controlled entirely by willpower. But eventually, a pattern becomes visible, one that repeats, regardless of how many times they attempt to escape it. At first, they begin strongly. They remain disciplined for a period of time. Then, gradually, without obvious cause, they return. Not suddenly, not violently, but through small decisions that appear insignificant in the moment. A delay here, a compromise there, a slight reduction in effort that seems harmless. And before they fully recognize it, they are once again living inside the same pattern they intended to escape. This return is not accidental. It is the consequence of identity. A man will always behave in ways that align with what he believes of identity. A man will always behave in ways that align with what he believes himself to be. He may temporarily act beyond that belief, but such effort cannot be sustained indefinitely. The mind seeks consistency, and it will eventually guide him back toward what feels natural. And what feels natural is not determined by what is best. It is determined by what is familiar. This is why so many individuals live the same year repeatedly. The calendar changes, new goals are created, yet they continue operating from the same identity. They attempt new actions while maintaining the same internal standards. And despite effort, their results remain unchanged. It is not because they lack desire, it is because they have failed to transform the source from which their actions emerge. Habits are never random. They are expressions of identity. Every repeated action reflects a belief, often unspoken yet deeply embedded, about what a person accepts as normal, what he tolerates, and what he permits within his life. This internal standard functions quietly. It does not announce itself during decision-making. It does not demand attention. It simply guides behavior. When a man attempts to act beyond this standard, it does not announce itself during decision-making. It does not demand attention. It simply guides behavior. When a man attempts to act beyond this standard, resistance emerges. Not because the action is impossible, but because it conflicts with what he has accepted as his identity. This resistance is frequently misunderstood as lack of discipline or lack of motivation. In reality, it is misalignment. The action belongs to a different version of the man than the one he currently believes himself to be. And so he returns, not because he failed, but because he remained unchanged. It must be understood that identity is not formed in a single moment. It is constructed through repetition, through repeated thoughts, actions, and standards accepted over time. Each repetition strengthens the image a man holds of himself until that image becomes fixed, not in reality, but in belief. And belief, once established, governs behavior. This is why a man cannot simply become fixed, not in reality, but in belief. And belief, once established, governs behavior. This is why a man cannot simply decide to live differently and expect that decision alone to sustain itself. Decision may initiate movement, but it does not determine direction. Direction is determined by identity. Consider the individual who views himself as disciplined. He does not debate endlessly about whether he should act. He acts because action aligns with who he believes himself to be. Now consider the individual who sees himself as inconsistent. He may attempt discipline temporarily, but sustaining it becomes difficult because every action requires resistance against his own self-concept. An effort that opposes identity cannot survive forever. This is the silent authority governing human behavior. It determines what a man does when no one is watching. It shapes his response when motivation fades. It influences whether he continues or retreats. Human behavior. It determines what a man does when no one is watching. It shapes his response when motivation fades. It influences whether he continues or retreats. And because this force operates beneath awareness, many attempt to change their lives without ever confronting it directly. They focus only on action. They attempt to build habits without redefining the person performing them. They push forward with effort only to be pulled backward by what feels familiar. And in this struggle, frustration grows, not because they are incapable, but because they are working against themselves. The man who desires a different year must understand this clearly. He cannot rely solely on effort. He cannot depend on temporary motivation. He cannot expect different results from an unchanged identity. He must become different, not merely in declaration, but in standard, not only in thought, but in what he accepts as normal within himself. This transformation, not merely in declaration, but in standard, not only in thought, but in what he accepts as normal within himself. This transformation does not require immediate perfection. It requires awareness. Awareness that what a man repeatedly does reflects what he believes himself to be. And if he desires different actions, he must establish a different identity. That process begins with a decision not simply to behave differently, but to define himself differently, to determine what he will no longer tolerate, to establish standards that reflect not who he has been, but who he intends to become. At first, this will feel unfamiliar because he is moving beyond what repetition has reinforced. He is acting in ways that do not yet feel natural, but this discomfort is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of change. What is new must feel unfamiliar before it becomes established. The individual must not must feel unfamiliar before it becomes established. The individual must not retreat during this stage. He must understand that discomfort is not opposition. It is proof that he is no longer operating according to his former identity. And if sustained long enough, this new pattern begins to establish a new standard. Others will begin to notice this transformation. They may not They may not understand its source, but they will recognize its effects. They will see that he no longer behaves as he once did, that his actions carry consistency, that his presence reflects discipline and control. And through this observation, they begin assigning him a different value. Because people are judged not by what they intend, but by what they consistently do. Therefore, the individual who transforms his identity transforms the way he is perceived by others. More importantly, he transforms the relationship he has with himself. He no longer questions whether he will follow through. He no longer debates whether he will act. He becomes aligned. And within that alignment, effort decreases. Action becomes natural. Consistency becomes expected. This is the true foundation of transformation, not temporary improvement, but lasting change. And so, if a man desires a different year, he must first become a different man. Not through force, not through temporary effort, but through the deliberate construction of a new identity, one capable of governing his actions without constant struggle. And let him affirm with quiet certainty, I am governed not by temporary intention, but by the identity I establish. I become the man whose actions reflect his standards. And through that man, I shape my life. Intention, but by the identity I establish. I become the man whose actions reflect his standards. And through that man, I shape my life. After a man begins to understand this truth, he also begins to recognize something even more dangerous than failure itself. It is the silent pull of familiarity, the tendency to return to what is known, even when what is known has already produced dissatisfaction, limitation, and regret. This return rarely announces itself openly. It does not appear as destruction in a single moment. It emerges gradually through subtle compromises that seem harmless at first. A postponed action, a lowered standard, a quiet justification whispered to oneself in moments of weakness. And because each compromise appears insignificant in isolation, the individual fails to recognize that he is rebuilding the very patterns he once swore to escape. That is how regression operates. Quietly, patiently. Through repetition so subtle that a man often realizes he has returned only after he is already standing once again inside the life he intended to leave behind. The mind naturally gravitates toward what is familiar. Even suffering can become familiar. Even limitation can become comfortable when it has been repeated long enough. This is why transformation demands more than temporary effort. It demands sustained resistance against the old identity until the new identity becomes stronger than the former one. Most people underestimate this stage. They believe the hardest part is beginning. In reality, the hardest part is continuing after emotion fades. Anyone can act with intensity for a short period of time. Few can remain disciplined when inspiration disappears and progress becomes invisible. This is the point where character is revealed. The individual who relies on emotion will slow down the moment emotion, but the individual who operates from identity continues regardless of feeling. He understands that discipline is not an emotional state. It is a decision repeated until it becomes nature. There will be mornings when action feels heavy, days when the mind searches for excuses, moments where comfort appears more attractive than growth. In those moments, the old self attempts to reclaim authority. It whispers that rest can wait another day, that delay is harmless, that returning briefly to old habits will not matter. But every repeated compromise strengthens the former identity, and every act of discipline strengthens the new one. This is why transformation is built in moments that appear insignificant. The decision to continue when stopping would feel easier. The decision to maintain standards when no one would notice if they slipped. The decision to act correctly without applause, recognition, or immediate reward. These moments appear small, yet they determine everything. For identity is shaped through evidence. Every action becomes proof. When a man repeatedly follows through, he sends a message to himself that he is dependable. When he repeatedly breaks his word to himself, he reinforces weakness internally. And over time, that internal evidence becomes belief. This is why self-respect cannot be separated from discipline. A man trusts himself only after he has proven through repeated action that his decisions carry weight. Confidence is not created through positive thinking alone. It is built through evidence accumulated over time. The disciplined man walks differently because he knows something about himself. He knows he acts even when he does not feel like acting. He knows he continues when discomfort appears. He knows he does not abandon himself the moment difficulty arises. That certainty changes everything. It changes the way he speaks, the way he thinks, the way others perceive him. His presence begins to carry stability because his behavior is no longer governed by impulse. He becomes reliable to himself first and therefore reliable to others. And this reliability creates power because the world responds differently to individuals who demonstrate consistency. Opportunities move toward those who can sustain responsibility. Trust is given to those who repeatedly follow through. Influence belongs to those whose actions remain steady under pressure. This is why personal transformation always extends beyond the individual himself. Once identity changes, relationships change, standards change, opportunities change. Entire environments begin responding differently because the person operating within them has changed. The man who once searched endlessly for motivation now understands something deeper. Motivation is unstable. Identity is enduring. And once this understanding becomes clear, he stops asking himself whether he feels ready. He stops negotiating with discomfort. He stops waiting for the perfect emotional state to begin acting. He simply moves. Because action is no longer a struggle against himself. It has become an expression of who he is. This is the point where transformation becomes visible, not through dramatic announcements, but through consistency sustained over time. The individual becomes calm where he was once reactive, focused where he was once distracted, disciplined where he was once inconsistent. And eventually, the life around him, but begins reflecting the order he has established within himself. For a man's external world eventually mirrors his internal standards. If his standards are weak, his results will reflect weakness. If his standards are inconsistent, his outcomes will remain unstable. But when his standards become strong, disciplined, and unwavering, his life begins organizing itself around that structure. This is why lasting change is organizing itself around that structure. This is why lasting change is never accidental. It is constructed deliberately through identity, discipline, repetition, and standards maintained long after emotion fades. And so the man who truly desires a different future must ask himself a deeper question. Not merely, what do I want? But who must I become in order to sustain it? Because achievement without identity collapses. But achievement built upon transformation endures. And let him affirm with absolute conviction, I no longer return to the habits that weaken me. I no longer negotiate with the standards that define me. I act in alignment with the man I have chosen to become. And through disciplined consistency, I create a life that reflects that identity. There comes a stage in this process where the individual begins to understand that transformation is not maintained through intensity alone, but through structure. Emotion may begin the movement, but structure sustains it. Without structure, even the strongest intentions eventually collapse beneath inconsistency. This is why so many men experience temporary progress, yet fail to sustain lasting change. They depend upon motivation to carry them forward, not realizing that motivation is unstable by nature. It rises and falls according to circumstance, emotion, and environment. A man who depends entirely upon feeling will inevitably become inconsistent, because feeling itself is inconsistent. The disciplined individual understands something different. He understands that freedom is not created by the absence of structure, but by the presence of it. The structure he builds becomes the system that protects him from returning to his former condition. This structure appears in the standards he maintains daily, the routines he refuses to abandon, the boundaries he establishes around his attention, his time, his energy, and his behavior. These actions may appear small to others, yet they are the invisible architecture of transformation. For a man does not suddenly become disciplined in critical moments. He reveals the discipline he has practiced repeatedly in ordinary moments. The way he begins his mornings, the way he responds to distraction, the way he acts when tired, frustrated, or unnoticed. These moments reveal whether discipline exists as identity or merely as temporary effort. Most individuals wait until circumstances become difficult before attempting control, but by then the mind returns to whatever patterns have already been reinforced. Under pressure, people rarely rise above their conditioning, they fall back into it. This is why daily standards matter. Every repeated action strengthens either the future or the past. Every routine either reinforces discipline or reinforces disorder. There is no neutrality in repetition. The man who understands this becomes intentional with what he practices. He recognizes that habits are not isolated behaviors. They are votes cast repeatedly for the identity he is becoming. If he practices delay, he strengthens hesitation. If he practices discipline, he strengthens execution. If he practices distraction, he weakens focus. If he practices consistency, he strengthens self-trust. Over time, these repeated actions accumulate into character, and character determines destiny far more reliably than temporary emotion ever could. This is the point where transformation becomes deeply internal. The individual no longer seeks external validation for his discipline. He no longer requires applause to continue. He acts correctly because his standards demand it, even when no one observes the action itself. This is true self-command, to remain disciplined without recognition, to maintain standards without external pressure, to continue forward even when progress appears slow and ill. Because the strongest transformations often occur long before results become visible externally. Roots develop beneath the surface before growth appears above it. And many individuals abandon the process precisely because they cannot yet see what is already being built within them. But the disciplined man continues. He understands that repetition compounds quietly. He understands that small actions sustained consistently possess more power than occasional bursts of intensity. He understands that mastery is not created through dramatic effort once, but through disciplined execution repeated over time. This understanding changes his relationship with patience. He no longer seeks immediate reward from every action. He begins trusting the process itself. He understands that every disciplined decision strengthens identity, even before visible results appear. And because he trusts the process, he remains steady where others become impatient. This steadiness becomes rare. Most people live reactively. They move according to emotion, distraction, convenience, and circumstance. But the disciplined individual moves according to principle. His direction remains stable because it is rooted in standards rather than impulse. And this stability creates momentum. Once momentum develops, progress accelerates. Actions become more automatic. Resistance weakens. Focus sharpens. The individual begins producing results with greater consistency because his behavior is no longer fragmented by internal conflict. He becomes aligned. And alignment is powerful because energy is no longer wasted fighting oneself. The mind, actions, and standards begin operating together instead of against one another. This creates clarity. Decisions become simpler. Execution becomes faster. Hesitation loses influence. The individual who once struggled merely to begin now finds himself sustaining effort naturally. Not because life has become easier, but because he has become stronger. This is the difference most people fail to understand. Transformation does not remove difficulty from life. It transforms the person facing difficulty. The obstacles may remain, pressure may remain, uncertainty may remain. But the individual confronting them is no longer the same man who once retreated under their weight. He has built endurance, discipline, stability, self-respect, and these qualities allow him to continue where others stop. Eventually, this consistency produces something even greater than achievement. It produces inner certainty. The individual no longer wonders whether he is capable. He has accumulated too much evidence against doubt. He has seen himself continue too many times to fully believe the voice that once told him he could not. This certainty becomes quiet strength, not arrogance, not loud confidence seeking attention, but calm conviction built through repeated proof. He knows who he is because he has demonstrated it repeatedly through action, and that knowledge changes the way he moves through life. He becomes less reactive to distraction, less dependent upon approval, less vulnerable to temporary emotion. His identity stabilizes him. His standards guide him. His discipline protects him. This is the beginning of mastery over self, and the man who masters himself gains something the undisciplined rarely experience: the ability to trust his own direction completely. For he knows that regardless of circumstance, he will continue. And let him affirm with unwavering certainty, I do not rely upon temporary emotion to direct my life. I build structure, I uphold standards, I act with discipline regardless of circumstance. Through consistent action repeated over time, I strengthen my identity, and through that identity, I create a life aligned with purpose, strength, and self-mastery.